on, and I apologize, we are going to be recording this webinar, and then we're also going to be posting it on our YouTube channel that is the Texas Dairy Matters. All right, so the webinar is going to discuss what biochar is, the advantages of biochar to soil, crops, water quality, and some of the research that's being done currently with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension and Research from a grant that was funded by the USDA-NRCS and USDA NLGCA. So this webinar is going to be recorded, and we'd like you to remain muted for the remainder of this webinar. You can write any questions in the text box or the chat box, and then we'll have those answered by the presenter at the end of their presentation. So our first presenter is going to be Dr. Khan. He's an associate professor in the Department of Biological and Agricultural Engineering, and he is the principal investigator for this grant. Dr. Khan is going to be discussing what biochar is and some of the current research being done. So Dr. Khan, when you're ready, you can go ahead and share your screen.
I think so. For now.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you, Dr. Khan.
Sorry, it was on mute. Okay. Anyway, my talk will be for explaining how to produce biochar and how to apply biochar, and then any benefit for using biochar for agriculture. And then what is biochar? So the biochar is a charcoal-like material made from different waste, especially the agricultural waste. So when you see the waste from agriculture, could be the animal manure, and the grass and hay and crop residue and wood waste. And also there are many biosolid from the wastewater treatment plant. So using those, the feedstock, we can make a biochar using, we call the pyrolysis. So basically this biochar is heated at 300 to 800 degrees Celsius for 10 minutes to even several hours. And then during this heating process, those feedstocks are converted to biochar as a product. So when you see these figures, small a this is actually raw dairy manure, and then right side is actually converted to the manure biochar. Also at the bottom, this is actually the dry hay, and then this one is biochar from dry hay. So we can make such a biochar from the dairy manure or waste hay or from crop residue. And more likely, currently, most of biochar for the agronomic applications is made at 300 to 350 Celsius for up to couple hours. So the conventional biochar production usually made at 500 degrees Celsius for half hour to 1 hour. But compared to conventional process, actually currently I'm using the little bit lower temperature to make this biochar. That's because this low temperature allowed us to use low energy consumption, which is more economical. And then you can see these figures in this slide. The figure is lab scale biochar reactor. So using this lab scale bioreactor, we can make a small amount of biochar in the lab for more like a research purpose. But when we need huge amount of biochar for a huge area of application, actually right-hand side, this is actually commercial scale pyrolysis biochar reactor. And this biochar reactor usually allowed several tons per biochar per day. And especially my lab has maybe a pilot scale size, the biochar reactor, which is allowed us to make 100 to 200 kilogram biochar per day. Still, it is quite good for the field demonstration. So as I mentioned, the biochar source feedstock is usually animal manure, grass, hay, wood, and sludge. Of course, it requires heating temperature about 300 to 800 degrees Celsius, depending on our application. As I told you, as a biofertilizer oil soil amendment, the biochar can be made at 350 to 400 degrees Celsius. That's enough temperature. And as I told you, once we make a biochar from dairy manure or grass, we can harvest biochar about 35% yield from feedstock. So if we have 100 gram dairy manure, we can make a 35 gram biochar from the process. This biochar has a lot of actually application, such as fertilizer, water and gas filter. And also, along with biochar, we can harvest bio oil about 30% yield. This bio oil is one of the alternative biofuel we can convert to diesel or jet fuel by several process. And then also we can harvest syngas, which is quite an energy-rich gas containing carbon monoxide and hydrogen. Those gas is converted to heat internally so that energy from syngas can support this process. And this slide could be the most important slide to summarize the application of biochar for several places. And one example is dairy manure biochar. And then interesting is when I made this biochar from dairy manure at 350 degrees Celsius, it has a certain surface area, not too high, but still some surface area. And then important thing is this manure biochar has relatively lower carbon, 38% carbon. If we make a biochar from wood or grass, the carbon content in biochar is up to 60 to 70, 80%. So manure biochar has a lower carbon content, but when you see nitrogen and phosphate and potassium, such a nutrient is quite high in manure biochar. So that manure biochar could be a good biofertilizer when we apply the field. And one of the opposite side of the biochar is wood biochar or grass biochar. Wood and grass biochar has high carbon content, but very little nutrient content, so that it can be good for water retention and then organic contaminant removal and water quality, but not really good for biofertilizer. And talking about the current application is, I think the most familiar application is the agriculture. Once we apply biochar to the farm, actually this biochar release nutrient to soil very slowly. So when we apply chemical fertilizer or organic manure, actually is immediately released, but some of them is actually run off and lost in groundwater or from surface water. But biochar itself is quite a release the nutrient slowly. It means we can sustain the fertilization over the long-term period. Of course, this biochar retain nutrient in soil and then also slow release. As I told you, the biochar has several functional groups so that it can hold water more than soil, so that actually biochar could be a kind of sponge-like material to hold more water over the long-term period. It is beneficial for the semi-arid or arid area. And then also the biochar in soil enhance soil fertility. One example, once we add the manure biochar to the field, actually it increased nutrient content in soil, which is really beneficial for plant growth. Also, it can actually make a more diverse microbial community. It means it's more help the plant growth and soil fertility. Recently, many people are interested in greenhouse gas emission control from the farm field, and the biochar could be one of the most feasible technology to reduce greenhouse gas emission, because there are several reports that actually biochar applied to the farm minimize the greenhouse gas emission from the farm by several mechanisms. And also from the environmental aspect, the biochar could be a very good water and wastewater treatment material. So we can use biochar to filter and many contaminants from the water. So in my research, I report many papers, and the biochar remove the toxic contaminant from water, such as antibiotics, pesticide, and heavy metal, and currently algal toxins. So we can use this biochar as a good filter material to remove contaminant so that make a clean water from the wastewater. Also, this biochar can remove bacteria and virus using their own filtering and also their property. Recently, also, I'm interested into recovery of nutrient from wastewater using biochar. Of course, there are some animal farm, and they generate biogas from the animal manure, and then biogas contain quite some the H2S as an impurity. There are a lot of technology to remove H2S from biogas so that we can use biogas for internal engine. But basically, biochar could be a very cheap material to remove H2S from the biogas. Of course, this biochar can remove CO2 from the biogas, which is really good for CO2 capture from biogas. And then a little bit away from the agriculture, but this biochar could be modified activated carbon, and then it can be used as the battery or energy device. And talking about the more specific application of biochar for agriculture. In short, as I mentioned, it is a slow release fertilizer, so that one example is if we apply manure itself and also manure biochar. Actually, manure biochar release nutrient only 20% of dairy manure over time. This means dairy manure biochar release the nutrient 5 times slower than dairy manure. It means over the 5 times longer time, biochar sustain the supplying fertilizer to the soil. Also, biochar itself, they can retain excessive nutrient from the manure and chemical fertilizer. This is important, especially related to groundwater contamination or runoff water. And many reports actually show biochar retain nutrient so that we can minimize water quality issue. As I told you, the wood and manure biochar has a higher water holding capacity than sandy loam soil. For example, one of those biochar has 17 times or 7 times higher water holding capacity than sandy loam soil. This means it is a very good tool to overcome the drought the problem. And also the biochar providing nutrient, water, organic carbon to the soil, which is good for actually environmental pollution control. As also on the other side, it can enhance the plant growth, soil fertility, and also soil microorganism. This slide shows just my own, actually Dr. Muir and I conduct the greenhouse test using biochar to support plant growth. So you can see those parts, 0% means the no biochar in this part, and then 1 to 8% means, let's say 8% biochar in the pot. And then we try to cultivate the Bermuda grass on each pot. At the end of the greenhouse test, we can show quite a high plant growth with 8%, 4% biochar than control. So that the main message from those trials is actually once we add 1% to 8% biochar to the soil, it can enhance several times higher plant growth. At the same time, soil was very fertile with the biochar. I think that is a very directly indicating the benefit of this biochar to the farm application. And another thing interesting is many farms probably are looking for better nutrient management, either fertilizer or organic compost or manure application. But this biochar can recover the nutrient from wastewater. So one of the example is I developed this biochar. This biochar surrounded by calcium oxide and calcium hydroxide. And then when I put this biochar to dairy wastewater, essentially this biochar capture phosphate in wastewater, so that at the end, this biochar combined with phosphate fertilizer. This is the way we can recover phosphate fertilizer from the dairy wastewater using biochar, so that we can use this phosphate bound biochar as a whole biofertilizer having rich phosphate. So my just calculation show in the United States, we have about 9 million dairy cows. And then each year, actually 1.9 billion cubic meter dairy wastewater effluent release. It's a huge amount of dairy effluent. Also, it has huge amount of phosphate fertilizer. So that if we recover those phosphate using biochar, we save $35 billion phosphate fertilizer using this technology. So this is one of the big picture of the phosphate fertilizer recovery using biochar. And another thing is that we make a biochar different source, and then this biochar remove contaminant from water. More likely, let's say the antibiotics and pesticide in soil, in water can be removed by this biochar. And then currently, many processes use activated carbon to remove those contaminants from water. But if we can replace by our cheaper biochar, it saves a lot of money, and then also still improve the water quality in the farm, also in the domestic area. And probably the last the application is I know that a couple of places in Texas try to initiate the anaerobic digester to treat the dairy manure. Usually the bacteria degrade dairy manure to make a biogas, and which is a conventional practice, but many challenge to make a biogas from dairy manure by bacteria. But once we add, especially I add the manure biochar to the anaerobic digestion, actually we saw the biogas production was increased by 30% to 60%. Also, whole process time used to be a 20 and 40 day, but we saw the biochar assisted this process reduced maybe 1/3 of process time. This means we can make a very compact and smaller bioreactor, which is save 1/3 of total capital cost. So if anyone interested in AD system, I think biochar assisted AD system could be one of a sustainable manner to save the money. And recently, we are conducting a couple of projects to use biochar for dairy manure management. So in short, we have a huge amount of dairy manure from dairy farm, but as you know, problem is once we apply dairy manure to the farm, because of a high content of nutrient, especially the ammonia, the nitrogen, phosphate, actually easily contaminated water, soil, at the end also air. So since I work for actually Tarleton and AgriLife, especially quite close to work with the Southwest Dairy Center, and I've been working with actually better the dairy manure management using biochar. Actually, the concept is I convert dairy manure to biochar. This means we minimize problem of dairy manure disposal to the land. Also, this biochar remove nutrient and contaminant from dairy wastewater. This means we can even clean up and recycle dairy wastewater to the dairy farm system. And also, another aspect is biochar-driven phytoremediation for soil and water quality. This means this is actually our USDA NRCS project. We try to add biochar to the soil and plant system, and then under manure application, so that the conventional dairy manure application to provide several the water and soil pollution problem, but we try to minimize that problem using biochar. So basically, biochar remove excessive nutrient and then slowly release, so that we minimize water pollution problem. Also, biochar remove actually antibiotics or bacteria pathogen from soil and water. We minimize that problem. And then interesting is biochar can interact with soil bacteria or plant, and then soil bacteria plant uptake more nutrient, more contaminant, so that we minimize water and soil problem. I think bottom line is also, along with this environmental the issue, we also want to maintain sane plant growth and productivity. And for the couple of slides, I want to just share our current project. One is actually the USDA NRCS supported the project, the Conservation Innovative Project, over 3 years. And then the Texas A&M AgriLife is the leading institute, but also working with the Texas A&M Extension and Tarleton State and Texas Tech. In this project is actually biochar enhanced dairy manure management. This means, as I told you, we apply dairy manure and biochar together, and then the biochar retain nutrient and contaminant, so that we minimize the water pollution and soil pollution problem using biochar. We are just start to field the test last year, so that we don't have too many data, but in the next 6 months cycle, once we analyze the whole data, we have a very good summary of progress to assess the biochar impact on soil water quality in the farm. And another project is actually the research capacity grant to enhance environmental sustainability and dairy farm through the biochar technology. This is actually the Tarleton State is the leading institution. And in this case, we try to make a biochar from dairy manure and also waste hay. As I figure, actually 20 and 25% hay could be a fungi infected hay. At the end, it could be a waste hay. So we recycle waste hay to make a biochar. And then we evaluate the manure biochar versus waste hay biochar in terms of nutrient recovery or in terms of removal of antibiotics pathogen from the dairy wastewater, so that at the end we can actually make economic assessment biochar technology at this farm. One of the co-PI in this project is Dr. Edward Osei, and right now he's make an economic model to predict the profit of biochar at the farm. And this is one of the summary of those process. Basically, dairy farm generate dairy manure and waste hay, and then we use the biochar reactor to make a biochar. And then this biochar could be a biofertilizer at farm, also could be an independent product to be sold to actually commercial vendor. Currently, I observe actually several vendors such as Home Depot, Walmart sell the biochar base, the potting soil, and about $20 per certain pound. I think this is quite a good indication of commercialization of biochar to the garden and home purpose. And the last one is also the supported by USDA-NRCS, working with several centers at the Texas A&M AgriLife Center. And then the title is actually Sustainable Ecosystem for Dairy Manure Management. So in this case, we try to understand what are the impact of biochar on dairy waste derived phosphorus, nitrogen, and fecal bacteria, pathogen, and antibiotics over the long-term field test, also modeling purpose. So in the greenhouse and field demonstration, we want to evaluate of biochar to remove phosphorus, nitrogen, and also pathogen and antibiotics, also to assess soil fertility and plant growth. Also, on the other side, other faculty as the Dr. Jung is making a mathematical model to predict actually transport and transformation of those contaminants in the farm. Okay, so I think this is the all slide I can present today. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Khan. So we did have one question. So how do you make biochar from manure and biogas? How do you remove biochar from water with purities or dairy wastewater after purification?
Yeah, so essentially, we have several approaches, and one approach is basically from the barn to the solid liquid separator. We can separate solid manure versus liquid manure, and then solid manure is piled up in the farm, in the field for several days, and then that solid manure is converted to biochar. And then still liquid manure is going to lagoon or the anaerobic digestion reactor, so that we can use solid manure for biochar and liquid manure for the anaerobic digestion to make a biogas. And then once the biogas is generated from the lagoon or from the anaerobic digestion reactor using liquid manure, and then the biogas is contact to biochar, and then biochar remove the H2S and other impurity from the biogas. And after that, biogas is really purified, and then we can use it for energy purpose, internal combustion, or we can compress and send it to the utility as a alternative, the natural gas grade biogas.
Awesome. So we have another question. Are there potential applications to remediation of oil production, brine, contaminant soils?
Yeah, definitely. There are a lot of report is that biochar, especially biochar, I think more likely wood-based biochar currently, but this biochar is applied to oil contaminated site. And then this biochar remove partially toxic oil compound. At the same time, this biochar encourages soil bacteria to further remove the oil compound, so that over the long-term period, those biochar applied oil field minimize oil content in soil and also water release from the site.
Awesome. All right, the next question. Do you see opportunities for applying this technology to beef manure?
I'm definitely, yeah, because the biochar can be made from different kind of animal manure, such as dairy, beef, swine, poultry. The only thing is each manure has different chemical composition. So that once we make a biochar, I guess little bit different nutrient composition from the different animal manure, but in overall, we can make any kind of biochar using different kind of animal manure.
Awesome. So we don't have any more questions, so I think we'll go ahead and go on to Dr. Muir as the next presenter. So Dr. Muir is a Regents Professor in the Department of Soil and Crop Sciences, and he specializes in forage and rangeland management. And today he's going to be discussing crops and soil effects that biochar has.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to share my screen here. My co-author is Dr. Paul DeLaune. He's a soil ecologist up at Vernon with AgriLife. I myself am a plant ecologist. A lot of what I'm talking about today, I'm filling in for Dr. DeLaune because he was unable to participate. And so a lot of what he prepared for his portion of this talk is new to me as well. So it's always good when I can learn something from him. We're going to focus a little bit more on the effects of biochar on agricultural ecosystems here in north central and western Texas. We're going to focus primarily on pastures, the soils aspects and the forage aspects, because in our part of the world, that's what's most important. I realize that other parts of Texas have crops, row crops, but here we're focused primarily on the forages. Obviously, to meet growing demand for food, using less land, fewer inputs, and while doing that, sparing the environment so that our children and our children's children will have a healthy world to live in, not just with food, but an enjoyable place. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about what biochar is, because Dr. Khan has already done a good job talking about that. And I use it interchangeable with biocarbon or organic carbon. That's obviously produced with very low oxygen and high temperatures, as Dr. Khan has already pointed out, and very stable in the soil compared to most other organic carbon, and has a long-term effect. Very much like, if you're a soil scientist, very much like the component we would call humus. And so that's what we're talking about, long-term, medium and long-term, not short-term, but long-term. Terra Preta in Brazil is a good example of this. I'm sure you've seen specials on television about it. There are plots in the Amazon that were put together by pre-Columbian agriculturalists in the Amazon that to this day have permanent effects on soil and soil fertility. So it's not a new idea by any means. In these areas, for example, those soils are still very much richer, more fertile than the soils around them. And we're not talking about adding composted or even manure or ash from burned material. Those are very, very different from biochar. So we get the impression from Terra Preta in the Amazon that it was a happenstance, a happy byproduct of producing charcoal. It is not. It was specifically done by agriculturalists to modify soils over the long term. They produced biochar, not ash and not organic material that was added, for example, manures and so forth. And like I said, it's centuries later there and in other places around the world, biochar has permanently changed agricultural soil. So that's what we're learning from, a long tradition of biochar. Hopefully after this talk, you'll have a better idea of what biochar, soil biocarbon can do for the soil and plants, especially in pastures and rangeland and so forth. Is it useful for you if you're a practitioner or an agency person that helps others? Should you be talking about biochar or not? And then if I'm honest with you, I'll let you know a little bit about what we don't know still, and that's where the research is taking place. Dr. Khan is leading an effort with Dr. Spencer and others that focus on learning more about what we can do here in North Central Texas with biochar. Just to let you know, a lot of the images are not mine, so don't be surprised if you see something familiar. Here's a good example. And this is, I love this photoshopped, obviously, image, because it tells us what we're trying to do. When we talk about applying biochar to agriculture, we're basically just imitating nature. We are not recommending something that's new to nature. It's very much what nature does. And in terms of the biology, we know a little bit about it. The economics, we're learning more. Dr. Osei is part of the group, as Dr. Khan mentioned, at Tarleton. But I think even more importantly, cultural differences and misunderstandings quite often are an issue. We tend to think of agricultural production as what we can sell this year. When we look at, if you're a wheat farmer and look at the war in Ukraine, this year the wheat prices are going to go through the roof, and that's what's important on the short term. Biochar is not about the short term, and that's that's not necessarily part of our culture to think medium to long term. Thinking of what the soils are going to be producing in 500 years is not part of what we're taught when we are taught land husbandry, when we're taught to take care of our soils. So that's what we're doing when we imitate nature, is breaking outside of our biological limitations, economic limitations, but also cultural limitations. And so again, I'm focusing on the area to the west of I-35, Interstate 35. Because of low rainfall and fertile soils, harsh climate, very cold in the winter, very dry, hot in the summer. We are focused primarily on pastures. There's some irrigation, obviously, with row crops. That irrigation is going to run out. And sooner or later, this whole region is going to be animal production exclusively. And so that's what we're talking about in terms of biochar. Why is it important? I think Dr. DeLaune's slides that I'll be going through in a little bit will give you a good explanation as to why it's important. And the cycles of the nutrients, I think, are the telling portion. When we lose nutrients to the air through volatilization or leaching or runoff through water, we're losing nutrients that could be taken from the animal to the plant via the soil. And so that's what we're talking about, is using biochar to make nutrient cycling and grazing system more efficient. And our tendency quite often, for those of you who are soil scientists, I'm preaching to the choir. Those of us who are plant scientists or farmers, ranchers, wildlife managers, we always tend to think of what's above ground. These days we look out there in north central Texas and it's kind of sad, dry, yellow, and we're worried about what's going on because of what we see on the soil of the surface. I think we need to look more and more, and soil scientists will tell us all this, will agree with us. We need to look more and more at the layers below, not just the topsoil, but this organic component just below the plants, and that's where biochar really plays an important role. So it's a lot more. Soil is a lot more than simply a place for plants to grow. It's also important to understand what component of the soil we're talking about. And again, I'm a plant scientist, so this is a little bit outside of my field, but we're talking about the clay or humus, the organic components of the soil that are able to hold nutrients or hold moisture. And that's what we're talking about more than anything else. The soil degradation has been an issue in the 20th century, and it's obviously spilled over into this new century. And we've severely depleted the ability of our soil to provide ecosystem services because of our misunderstanding of the soil organic component. Biochar can correct that by decreasing erosion, by increasing fertility, and by decreasing soil degradation in general. The agricultural use of biochar can improve soil physical properties, especially in terms of the organic carbon component, the stable organic carbon component. It can also improve fertility. Not necessarily directly, and I hope that this message comes through. Biochar is not normally added to provide nutrients. It's added to manage nutrients, and that's an important distinction to make. And certainly very important, just like clay or other organic components in the soil, it's added to manage soil moisture as well and quality. And Dr. DeLaune goes into a series of descriptions here in terms of what or how biochar affects the soil. And he talks about soil density. And basically biochar introduces more pore spaces and more voids between the soil particles. And so the effectiveness of biochar is dependent on soil texture. We'll talk a little bit more about this later, but if you have a sandy soil, biochar is a good thing. You need to look at it. If you have a high clay or high organic soil, like a bottomland somewhere, then perhaps biochar isn't necessarily for you. And the source of that biochar is important, as Dr. Khan has mentioned. Soil has a lot of different characteristics, and the biochar will increase the beneficial aspects of some of these. And when we're talking about soil strength, which is a term that's new to me, I'd never thought of soil as being strong or weak. We're talking about the porosity and the specific surface area and so forth that biochar can increase compared to other components like sand. We can also increase the resilience of the soil to disruption, such as heavy rainfall, wind erosion, aeolian erosion, and so forth. Biochar can be a very important component there. Once again, because it maintains those soil pores and basically changes the microhabitat, microbiome even of the soil that our next speaker, Dr. BY, will talk about. And again, this is a slow process. Biochar is not the addition of manure. It's not the addition of other byproducts from organic products. It is a very long-term addition to those soils. It'll increase your water holding capacity without question. And in and of itself, and within the soil, it increases the capacity of the soil to hold water beyond simply what the biochar. So it's a compounding mitigative property, which is important to understand. And once again, and I'm going to say this several times, you're going to get tired of me hearing it. If you have a coarse soil with a high content of sandy texture compared to clay or humus, then biochars are definitely for you. The movement of water, not just on the surface of the soil, but through the soil, is also affected by biochar, and obviously decreases water erosion by doing so. If you have a coarser biochar that improves water infiltration, if you apply a powdery biochar, it actually reduces infiltration. So keep that in mind. The type of biochar, how much is ground and so forth, will change the effectiveness of what you're applying. So be aware of what you're purchasing and what you're applying to your soils. The nutrient content of biochar, like I mentioned, is relatively small. Depends on what source you use. The dairy manure biochar will have more nutrients, for example, than wood biochar, and that's what Dr. Khan's lab is working on, is dairy manure that'll be able to contribute some nutrients to the soil, whereas others that are more lignified sources have much fewer nitrogen and phosphorus elements to contribute. And so usually biochar, again, is not applied because of the nutrient content, but because it affects or increases the effectiveness of the other fertilizers that are applied along with it. And so the temperature at which it's produced changes nutrient bioavailability from biochar. And so starting from 400 degrees on, most of the nitrogen is lost. And so once again, if you're looking for biochar as a fertilizer source, you're looking in the wrong place for it, because most of the biochars that are available commercially have already lost all of or most of their nutrient components. Biochar can also be used as a liming agency. It can change soil pH. It can buffer soil pH, and that changes the ability of the soil to hold nutrients. In our case, with dairy phosphorus, that's our main concern in this area. It definitely changes what the soil can hold. Acidic soils are going to hold phosphorus a lot more than neutral soils. And so if you're looking for an alternative source for lime, biochars are a good source. Once again, nitrogen as a source, biochar is rather limited. And if you're talking about clay soils or high organic material, high humus soil, biochar may not be for you. But coarse soils, on the other hand, absolutely. It'll help with nutrient retention, especially nitrogen, and which is a huge issue for us. When it rains or when it heats up, we're losing most of the nitrogen that we apply as fertilizer. When you include biochar in the mixture, then the nitrogen and the phosphorus can be tied up, which is an issue. If you have low nutrient content in the soil and you apply biochar, you're going to have even less available for your plant to utilize. So you're going to have to add more fertilizer, whether it's organic or industrial, inorganic fertilizer, to make up for what's being tied up in the biochar. So water quality has also changed. And the ability to filter water, essentially to clean out water, is well known with biochar. So it's a positive in this regard, and it'll retain nutrients for longer. They'll basically tie them up on the surface. So in terms of water quality, biochar invariably is a benefit, as well as runoff moisture for the same exact reasons. It's able to act like a filter, just the same type of filter that you would use on your fridge at home. It has a coal-based filter. Biochar is doing exactly the same thing with runoff moisture, just like it is with infiltration. And then, of course, the soil erosion that reduces because of it can be substantial, depending on the soil, the texture. It can go all the way up to 80% increase in reduction in soil erosion. Of course, if you incorporate it or not, if you apply it to the surface or not, etc., will affect where and how that biochar affects your soils. And you have to think it through. You have to realize what it's doing and how you can use it to better effect. It definitely decreases the total runoff, as well as the nutrients in that runoff. So TCEQ, EPA are thrilled anytime anybody can use biochar. And once again, this is a two-edged sword. If you're applying biochar to pastures and crop fields without increasing the nutrient application from other sources, you're going to have a decrease in productivity in the short term. In the long term, you'll have more efficient use of those nutrients, but in the short term, you'll have a decrease. So keep that in mind. It's not a panacea. It won't solve all of your issues. And through the soil profile, the same thing. The more biochar you have, the less leaching you'll have, but also the less material or nutrients you'll have for plants. And so, as we mentioned before with Terra Preta in Brazil, the biochar is something you apply for the medium to long term. So we're talking 5, 10, 50, 100, 200 years. If you're a visionary and think that far into the future, you're talking about great grandkids, not just yourself today. The investments you make today may take away from your bottom line, but will add to your heirs' bottom line in the long term. And if you're if you look at it in terms of soil organic carbon sequestration and carbon credits, our prediction is that biochar use will end up being on the credit side of that. So just real quick, whether you're helping someone else or looking at your own land, everyone's familiar with these texture triangles, right? Sandy, clay, and silt. The farther you go to the bottom left-hand corner of sandy, the more likely you are to benefit from adding biochar to your soils. So keep that in mind. That covers pretty much all of our soils except for the blackland soils here and there and to the south of us. But if you're in Comanche County and you have those deep sandy soils, then biochar could be a very useful component in your system. So again, not to reiterate too much of what Dr. Khan mentioned, but it definitely, adding biochar increases, if you're a soil scientist, CEC, the ability to hold moisture or nutrients. It'll help you with long-term fertility, soil organic matter content. If you have low organic matter in your soil, this is the way to go. But it can also be used in the short term to mitigate, pathogens, as well as products that we don't want in there, including antibiotics and excessive nutrients such as phosphorus, which we get from applying dairy manure, dairy effluents to our fields. There are negatives to biochar. It's not all positive, so I don't want you to go away thinking that that's all positive. It will, in the short term, reduce your nutrient availability, especially micronutrients. So be very, very aware of that. If I were you and applied biochar, the first thing I would do after applying biochar is take a soil sample, send it down to the extension lab, and have them tell you, okay, what's going on in terms of, and include micronutrients in your analysis, because it could be problematic if you're not careful, especially if you apply biochar in large amounts. In terms of production, short-term production, obviously it's going to cost you. It's going to take a lot of work. So if you're talking or thinking about using biochar in your future, in terms of agriculture, again, a medium to long-term nutrient and soil management system, especially if our climate changes over the years and we get less and less moisture, biochar can be very effective. If fertilizer costs are going up, which they are with again, the disturbance that's going on in the Ukraine is a perfect example. Fuel prices going up, fuel prices go up, nitrogen fertilizer prices go up. So biochar, the efficacy and the return on investment for agriculture is important. If you're looking at the environment, and that should be a concern of yours, whether you're a consultant or you own land and plan to pass on this world to your children and their children and their great-grandchildren and so on. That should also be a factor. And biochar is invariably a positive in that regard. We are undertaking a lot of research, a lot of it with the soils and the plant. And we know actually surprisingly very little about biochar's efficacy in our soil, especially in North Central Texas. And with Dr. Khan's leadership and this team, we're able to focus this, and we'll have answers within the next 2 or 3 years for you, thanks to the funding that we've received from NRCS and USDA, and it's the DOE as well as TCEQ and so forth. So if you're asking yourself, should I even be worried about or be interested in biochar, you have to ask yourself whether having organic carbon in your soils is important. and your return on investment is going to be medium to long term, not necessarily short term. In fact, I would say it's not short term. It has to be thought of in terms of a medium to long term investment. If you're looking 50 years down the road, biochar is definitely something you should consider, because that's where you're going to get the benefit in terms of pasture production and soil health in north central Texas. In terms of environment, if you have immediate concerns in terms of too many nutrients in your soils, or antibiotics from your dairy wastes, pathogens from land application of urban waste and so forth, biochar is definitely where you should be looking at. And in terms of the benefits that are going to occur, not just immediately, but in the long term, it'll stabilize those environmental issues on your soil. There are costs. Biochar doesn't grow on trees, although Dr. Khan would argue against that, because we do make biochar from trees, but there is a cost, an environmental cost in manufacturing it, and transporting it, and applying it. And so you have to look at the cost benefit analysis to make sure that in the short term, I think you're going to have a hard time justifying it, but in the medium and long term, absolutely, you're going to be benefiting the environment. So the questions we're asking ourselves, and we hope to have to answer you in the near future, are, when should you be concerned with using biochar? Is it worthwhile, and why? Which sources to use? How much to apply? The raw material that it comes from? Whether we should be tilling it in or applying it to the surface. So forth. All those are questions that we're addressing in our current research here at Stephenville, at Vernon, and Temple, with Texas A&M AgriLife and Tarleton. And it's I'm very excited about these results in the near future, and looking forward to presenting them to you in future years. If you have any questions for us, these are our email addresses. Again, we both work for Texas A&M AgriLife. Dr. Paul DeLaune up in Vernon as a soil scientist, myself here as more of a plant scientist or grassland ecologist. Happy to answer any questions, as well as answer any questions you have today in terms of what we talked about today. Dr. Spencer, back to you. I don't know if there are any questions that need to be given or answered.
Awesome. I haven't seen anything in the chat box. There was a question about if the slides will be shared. So the webinar will be posted on the YouTube channel, Texas Dairy Matters. We also have a Facebook page that we'll put the link on, as well as our website, Texas Dairy Matters. But if you want to reach out to any of the presenters or myself, we can get in contact with you as well. But if you have any questions for Dr. Muir, you can go ahead and put it in the text box, or we'll go ahead and move on to the next presenter.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Muir. All right. We'll go ahead and get started. Our third presenter is Dr. BY. He is Dr. Jeff Brady's postdoctoral student. His presentation is entitled Biochar Type and Loading Rate Shape of Microbiology, Diversity and Functions in Soil Growth, Crimson Clover. So Dr. BY, if you want to go ahead and share your screen.
Okay. Thank you.
Started.
All right. Okay. 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 So, good day, everyone. I've been introduced. I am Olabiyi Obayomi, but you can call me DY. I'm a postdoc at Texas A&M AgriLife Research, specialty in microbiology and bioinformatics. And I work in Dr. Jeff Brady's lab. So today I'll be giving a very short piece, basically a fraction of the research we have performed, and how the biochar does affect the microbial communities and functions. So we've titled this one, Biochar type and loading rate shape the microbial community diversity and functions in soils growing crimson clover. Okay, so basically virtually all the talk today already said what I'm about to say, but I'm just going to give you a brief refresher. The major problem here is there's a lot of dairy manure being produced, and most of this is being land applied. This has several consequences, such as greenhouse gas emissions that affect our climate, changes our weather conditions, depletes our ozone layer and all that. We have also problems with excess nutrients in terms of nitrogen and phosphorus that's present in manure that is being leached or basically go down into our groundwater and pollute our water, renders them undrinkable. There's also the risk of pathogens. Pathogens that are endemic from within manure can be transferred to the soil and also to the crop. In the case of dairy manure, where you have a lot of residual antibiotics from treatment, this could lead to antibiotic resistance and antibiotic resistant genes that can make these pathogens otherwise very difficult to treat. There's also the possibility of a shift in the microbial diversity. I'll be giving a brief, just 2 sentences about what microbial communities mean, so you kind of follow the presentation. But the logic here is you have certain microbes that are usually within the soil that are responsible for several ecosystem functions, like biogeochemical cycles like nitrogen fixation, degradation of pollutants and all that. So if you apply manure, for example, directly, it can shift these communities. It can make, for example, you have a lot of antibiotic resistant bacteria and deplete all those microbes that are very useful for important functions. And this can render the soil ineffective in its usual ecosystem functions. So in the worst case scenario, you introduce these microbes and they eliminate all the indigenous microbes. The other case will be that you apply manure and it basically changes the physical and chemical properties of the soil. And this ultimately affects the microbe, basically changing the conditions within the soil. So, I mean, you've heard all about this. And, just like Dr. Kana said and Dr. Muir, these projects are about biochar, and one potential solution to this myriad of problems will be to convert this dairy manure that you produce into biochar. Like I said, I mean, he's already discussed what biochar is, how it's produced by pyrolysis and all that. Dr. Muir already talked about the stability and how biochar could retain nutrients for a very long period in the soil. But what I just want to pass as the key point here is that different biochars actually differ based on their physical chemical properties, based on the pyrolysis temperature and others. So we will expect that because of the varying properties of different biochars, we will have different effects of biochar on the soil communities that I'm going to explain in a bit. So when we say microbial communities or microbiome, in short, what we're saying is the collection of the microbes, the bacteria, the fungi, the viruses, and their genes present within an environment. In the case of this our study, we're talking about the soil. So we're talking about the indigenous microbes, the fungi and bacteria that we tested in the test for viruses, of course. But we're talking about these indigenous bacteria and fungi within the soil that are responsible for various functions. They're involved in nitrogen metabolism, carbon metabolism, and all that. If something bad happens to them, we basically have a loss of the function, and we have a poor soil that that's not able to function very well. So it's actually very important to try to understand what the effect of biochar will be on these microbes that are very important to our environment. So what do we know from the literature about the effects of biochar on microbial communities? Overall, it's not all good. You basically read the literature, you have positive effects of biochar, you have no effects of biochar, and you have negative effects of biochar. This should not be a surprise because biochar actually varies in its properties. So depending on the biochar that you're dealing with, how you prepare the biochar, the source and all that, it actually affects what exactly you expect to see from biochar. So, however, the overall consensus here, so the common knowledge is that, biochar does increase microbial diversity, which will mean you have more different types of microbes that are able to do several functions that are very important within the soil. And it does alter the microbial communities. Okay, so like I said, this is just a little bit, a fraction of a big study that was performed here in Stephenville on a loamy sand soil that was growing crimson clover. Actually, there was also another plant, but I'm focusing on only crimson clover. And in this study, which was a greenhouse spot study, you can see these spots, for example. So with plants, and then in these spots, we had different types of biochars. In this case, we had wood biochar, which basically is biochar that was derived from wood. We had manure biochar that was derived from manure. We had blend, which is basically 50-50, so 50% manure, 50% wood. And in these different pots, the loading rates, right? So the amount of biochar that was applied was increased. So from in a pot, for example, with no biochar at all, to all the way to 10% of the pots of biochar. So what will be the effect? So the question, so several questions were asked, but how it relates to the microbiome, the microbial communities we talked about here. Our questions were, what's the effect of biochar and increasing biochar loading rate? So if we use wood, if we use manure, if we use blend, what's the effect on the diversity of the microbes, which will mean different types of microbes that we have there. What's the effect on the different types of microbes? Do we have an increase? Do we have a decrease? We say, what's the effect of biochar and its loading rate on the microbial functions? Like we said before, microbes are very important for several ecological functions, like nitrogen metabolism, phosphorus metabolism, and all that. So if biochar affects this positively, it could be a very good thing. If it affects it negatively, it's probably potentially a bad thing. So we really want to see, what's the amount we need to add, what type of biochar makes sense to use. And finally, of course, do different biochars differ in these responses in terms of the diversity of the microbes, in terms of the microbial functions. Okay, so now to the results from the experiment so far. So, so this can be a little bit daunting, but all you really need to pay attention to here is the y-axis on figure A, for example. It's written observed features, but you can think of this as number of species, so number of kinds of microorganisms. Okay, and then on the x-axis is number of sequences. I can explain to you that if you want to know what it is, but that's not what is so important. You need to look towards the end of the graph right here. And for A, for example, you see that, okay, so one thing I forgot to mention, in this presentation, red will always be blend biochar, green will always be manure biochar, and brown will always be wood biochar, right? So here, you see that there's a difference between the different biochars. You see that manure biochar actually does increase the diversity in terms of the types of the microbes there, right? A lot more than wood biochar. And blend, just because it's a mix of both, is basically in between, right? And then we see that every time we do increase the relative amount of biochar within the soil, we actually do increase the microbial diversity. We go all the way from 0, which is this color here, to 2, to 5, and then to 10. So biochar does increase the microbial diversity. It also depends on the type of biochar, but the more, in general, the more we increase the amount of biochar, we tend to increase the microbial diversity. So the key points from these two slides, from this slide basically, is that different biochar types affect the microbial diversity differently. And increasing biochar loading rate does increase the microbial diversity. So this plot can be a little bit confusing, but just bear with me for a second. What you really need to understand, for example, like I said, red will always be blend, green will always be manure, and brown will always be wood. So you can see, for example, so another thing to note is that any point that is close to each other actually means they are very similar. So for example, these points are similar, these points are very similar, these points are pretty similar, right? So what comes to our minds here, and we also see that we go from 0 biochar, which is like 0 circles, all the way to plus circles. So basically, if you have the plus sign, it basically means a lot or higher amount of biochar. If you have 0 circles, it means a low amount of biochar, right? So what's the key message from here? We see that the different biochar, so in this case, manure, blend, and then wood, they are pretty different from one another, right? The way the different biochars do affect the microbial communities different, right? And we see that these differences are even a lot more obvious at very high biochar loading rate, which is the plus signs, right? We see a gradient where we move all the way from low biochar all the way to high amount of biochar. So biochar loading rates, and also for blend, it goes up. So biochar loading rates and biochar type does affect the microbial communities. And we see, if you look at these arrows, for example, it's just telling us how related or how correlated these different chemical properties we measured. So in this case, we measured pH, calcium, zinc, and all that. We see that these actually correlate very nicely with high amounts of biochar. So it looks here that the nutrients are strong drivers in separation of this microbial community. So the nutrients are very important, and the different biochars actually differ in the microbial community structure. And so we've looked at the diversity in terms of the different types of microbes. We've seen that biochar differs based on different types. We've seen also that if we increase the biochar, we increase the diversity. We've looked at the overall community, so overall proportions, how samples kind of group together in the amounts. We see that biochar types does differ. Here we are looking at the relative amounts within a group. So on the x-axis, we are dealing here with the different loading rates. So we said we went all the way from 0 to 510, right? And all this is in blend, in manure, in wood. Okay, and like I said, this is relative amounts. So what is the relative amount of these microbes within this group, right? So to the key points here, really, as shown, in the previous slide where we saw that nutrients kind of increase at the high biochar loading rates. We see also that we have organisms, for example, proteobacteria, okay, proteobacteria, which is green, and bacteroidetes, which is kind of green here, that increase when we increase the biochar loading rates, right? This is because these microbes love a lot of nutrients. They love high pH. So biochar, when we increase the amount of biochar, we increase the pH, and we also increase the nutrients within the soil. So this actually is shaping the microbial communities there to kind of have microbes that tend to love these conditions. And we also have a decrease in the microbes. For example, here we have actinobacteria, which is the blue here, which is decreasing. We see it in blend, we see it in wood, right? But wood biochar, in manure, in wood biochar, it's pretty low amount of nutrient, and so these bacteria remains the same. So we see nutrient is a very strong driver of the community composition. And like you see, the different biochar types are different, and the different loading rate is different. But this selects for microbes that love these conditions, that are able to deal with these nutrients within the soil. Okay. So now in terms of the functions, right? So what can the soil do? What can the microbes do? Like I said, the microbes in the soil are very important for several ecosystem functions, right? So what we see here, again, red is always blend, green is always manure, and brown is always wood biochar. And we have an increase in the loading rates, right here. Okay, so what we see, so what you need to note in this kind of heat map is that, green is basically low, black is something in the middle, and red is a lot, kind of much. So what we see, again, is different. So wood, the pattern here in wood is very different from the pattern here in manure, which is different from the pattern here in blend. So the different biochar types are actually different, right? And see that genes actually increased, right? So we have an increase, which you see this red, in several genes in the ecosystem as a result of an increase in the biochar amount. So we didn't stop at this, because this is basically all the genes that are significant. We also went to check what is the effect of biochar on certain metabolic processes. In this case, carbon metabolism. In the coming slides, we'll be talking about nitrogen metabolism and phosphorus metabolism. We see again that different biochar types are different, right? Just like I showed before. And we have an increase, for example, in carbon metabolism genes right here. So what this means is that, particularly in manure, when we increase the amount of biochar, we are able to enhance genes that are involved in carbon metabolism. So we're able to degrade carbon, we're able to do all sorts of important ecosystem services in the soil. And this is primarily because the microbes that are being increased there are able to perform these functions. And also in terms of phosphorus, right? So in terms of phosphorus genes, we see the same pattern, right? A difference between the different biochar types. And we see, of course, that when we increase the biochar loading rates, we do increase phosphorus metabolism genes. We do increase nitrates metabolism genes. We do increase phosphorus metabolism genes. So particularly in manure biochar, we have an increase in the genes that are able to deal with nitrogen, able to deal with phosphorus within the soil. So this means, in addition to the slow release of nutrients by biochar, we are also enhancing new organisms and genes that are able to metabolize this phosphorus and nitrogen and carbon that has been produced in biochar. So to recap, just for general understanding, we see that biochar does alter the microbial diversity in terms of types of microbes. We see if, depending on the type of biochar we are looking at, we have more types of microbes when we're dealing with manure biochar. We saw that manure was a lot more, diverse than wood biochar. We saw that each time we did increase the loading rates, when each time we increased the relative amounts within the spots of biochar, we had an increase in the microbial diversity. So increasing biochar does increase the microbial diversity. We saw, like I showed you about organisms, about phyla like Bacteroidetes, Proteobacteria, Actinobacteria, were a lot more enhanced when we increased the amount of biochar. So these organisms like nutrient-rich environments, they like pH-rich environments, high pH environments. So this biochar actually resulted in the stimulation of these microbes that love to deal with this kind of conditions, high nutrient conditions. And finally here, we see that increasing biochar loading rates did increase the genes that were involved in phosphorus metabolism, nitrogen metabolism, like I showed in the heat maps. So this means that the soil has the capability to deal with nitrogen, has the ability to deal with nitrogen and phosphorus and carbon within the soil. Okay. So to conclude, based on my talk, based on Dr. Mia's talk, based on Dr. Khan's talk, we see very well that biochar does confer several benefits to the soil, and hence the crop. We saw in my case, it increases the microbial diversity. It increases the genes that are involved in different metabolic processes, which means your soil will have the ability to deal with these nutrients a lot better, and so on. So culture seems to be very promising. However, this project just started, right? And these are basically preliminary results. We also have warm season results, data. We have results from field studies. All these studies together with this will help us strengthen this finding and also help in giving further recommendations. So with that, I'd like to say thank you and thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was very interesting. So if anybody has questions, you can go ahead and put that into the chat box. We really appreciate you guys attending today's webinar. Once the meeting has ended, if you guys wouldn't mind staying on your browser, because a survey is going to pop up, and we would really appreciate your feedback on this webinar. And this will be posted on YouTube and also the Facebook page. Please follow us too, because we will announce other programs and events, and it's a great way to reach out to us with any questions. So if you don't have any more questions, you can go ahead and have a great day.